Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022,
Its smaller neighbor is paying a price for its role in Putin's war.
Lukashenko is unhappy with his international image as Russia's lackey.
Belarus is imploding today, and its collapse is a direct symptom of its alliance with Russia.
Belarus's latest economic figures tell a bleak story.
Belarus became increasingly dependent on the Russian economy, and unfortunately for Lukashenko, the Russian economy isn't looking too hot right now.
And Belarus just have to suffer the sanctions.
Today, we turn our focus to the heart of Europe's last remaining authoritarian regime, Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus. Once considered the cow of Europe for its subsidies and steady economy, it now stands exposed to multiple shocks. Food costs are soaring, factories are stalling, and a mass exodus of workers is draining the country's human capital. With Western sanctions biting, the economy is teetering. So how is Belarus still standing? How does it keep its economy alive? And what does that mean for its sovereignty? For decades, Belarus relied on a rather unusual mix of economic lifelines, and it's this money game that's now being put to the test. The function of potash comes first. Belarus mined and sold potash, a vital raw element used in fertilizers and vital to world agriculture, through the state-owned enterprise Belaruskali. Up to 1/5 of the world's potash production in previous years came from Belaruskali. It generated yearly export earnings that, depending on the year and volume, varied from about $2 billion to $3 billion, or roughly 7 to 9% of the nation's merchandise exports. For a nation without its own oil or gas deposits, a coastline, or internationally recognizable tech firms, that type of foreign exchange inflow was uncommon. Belarus successfully made its transit geography and small resource base a key component of its economic strategy. At the same time, Minsk also retained a legacy industrial base. Heavy machinery, tractors, trucks, industrial vehicles, and the like, built along Soviet-era lines and geared toward exports to Russia, Kazakhstan, and other post-Soviet states. The industrial sector, though not dynamic, offered steady employment and revenue. In parallel, Belarus played a middleman role in the oil value chain. Though it lacks significant crude oil itself, it has refined discounted Russian crude into fuels and petroproducts and then sold them. Significant gains were made during this window for refining and resale, but there were conditions: reliance on Moscow's supply choices, and goodwill. In addition, Belarus temporarily outperformed its peers in the technology sector through Minsk's High Technologies Park, HTP, a special economic zone. Founded in 2005, the HTP provided legal and tax advantages, drew in software outsourcing, and at its height, generated between 5 and 6% of GDP. Then geography came up. Due to its strategic location between Russia and the EU, Belarus had transit infrastructure including rail, pipelines, and freight, which the dictatorship was able to profit from by charging fees and employing as diplomatic leverage. Simply put, Belarus maintained stringent state control while assembling a patchwork of economic processes in the absence of natural resource booms. It turned its geography, a niche mineral, refining capacity, industrial heritage, and tech zone, into survival tools. Meanwhile, President Lukashenko built a system in which the state didn't just tax industries, it owned them, assigned their leadership, siphoned profits, and used employment and contract allocation to cement loyalty among the elite. Jobs, contracts, and subsidies flowed through a network of patronage, cementing the regime's grip. That system, however, is now under severe strain. The first major shock came from the post-2020 election protests in Belarus, which the West condemned as fraudulent, and responded to with sanctions targeting banks, major state enterprises, and state officials. Then in 2022, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and Belarus's role, hosting Russian troops and opening its territory for invasion routes, triggered further sanctions. The potash industry was severely impacted by logistical issues, Western prohibitions, and the loss of access to the vital Lithuanian port of Klaipėda for transshipment. As a result, Belaruskali was obliged to reroute via Russian ports or rail, which came at a greater cost. For instance, according to one institute, Belarus's market share in the world potash market fell from almost 20% prior to 2022 to 9% in that year. Additionally, despite Belarus's significant investments in its technology sector, the conflict and the crackdown after 2020 caused a brain drain, with thousands of IT specialists leaving the country, important enterprises moving, and the HTP's GDP contribution drastically declining. The emigration of Belarus's most skilled professionals is estimated to have cost the country over 1% of its GDP in 2022. Then, there is a lack of workers. According to official data, the number of employed people in Belarus decreased from approximately 4.3 million in 2020 to just over 4.2 million 2 years later. According to researchers, up to 100,000 workers, mostly younger Belarusians of working age, left during that time. This results in a loss of output potential for both industry and agriculture, in addition to a demographic challenge. Additionally, the promise of stability is dissolving and inflation is becoming more severe. Belarus has not fallen apart in spite of these obstacles. Recent projections indicate that its GDP recovered from a drop of approximately 4.7% in 2022 to grow by roughly 4% in 2024. How can that be? Because the regime effectively adapted. It doubled down on its eastern pivot. Potash exports that once headed to Europe are now directed to China, Brazil, and India. Although the volumes and margins are worse, the route exists. Refining and fuel sales continue through Russian-led networks. The tech sector reorients to the Russian market. Importantly, Moscow has provided Belarus with financial lifelines, loans, subsidized energy, and market access. Analysts say over 45% of Belarus's exports now go to Russia, and more than half of imports come from there. Thus, the regime is deeply dependent on Russia, but also strategically useful to it. Belarus is a buffer, a transit hub, and a geopolitical anchor for Moscow. Another survival mechanism: sanctions evasion and shadow trade. According to reports, Belarus serves as a gateway for commodities that are prohibited in the West to reach Russia through Belarusian middlemen. Although it is difficult to pinpoint exactly, Belarus has been named by EU authorities as one of the biggest loopholes in the sanctions framework against Russia. Lifelines are provided by private sector activities and remittances, but on a lower scale. According to experts, Belarus's economy may have benefited from an additional $4 billion to $4.6 billion in value added per year if it had been able to keep many of the emigrants. According to some figures, the private sector today accounts for about 45% of GDP and operates in areas that the government tolerates as semi-gray. The user story mentioned the private sector at 45%. The dual-track economy is true, even though the precise percentage is up for debate. Lukashenko's political economic model thus relies on tight state control over major industries, a loyal elite bloc tied to the regime via jobs and contracts, subsidies to maintain social peace, and adaptability in trade and transit flows. Even when incomes and living standards fall short of those of neighbors, social acceptance is maintained by free healthcare and education, subsidized utilities, and a sense of continuity. Even while many of its transit-based or export-led revenue streams are gradually declining, the regime is still making money from them. We are left with a nation torn between adaptability and loss of sovereignty, between survival and dependency. Belarus's model is clearly weaker now than it was when it appeared to be a clever remnant from the Soviet era. At the expense of increased reliance on Russia and structural deterioration in dynamic sectors, the government manages to stay in power. With the potash export engine under strain, the tech boom reversed, the labor force shrinking, and sanctions tightening, the question becomes, how long can Belarus keep going on this patchwork survival model? What if Russia's own economy falters, remittances decline, or new sanctions cut the transit and evasion channels? Belarus is not collapsing, but it is not thriving, and its sovereignty is increasingly tethered to Moscow. The regime of Alexander Lukashenko is therefore not just an isolated authoritarian state. It is a deeply embedded case of how politics, geography, economic dependency, and adaptation interlock. The money game he plays involves state control, export niches, transit leverage, and shadow trade, all mediated by political loyalty and strategic partnerships. For now, it keeps Belarus standing. But the cracks are real.